All right. Well, thanks guys for coming. Glad to be in the normal things from our storm yesterday or last week. So, all right. So we are starting with the Morley book. Last week or 2 weeks ago, we did go through Abraham. So we want you again. We really want you to buy the book. I still have that one book that's available. It's just $6. So let me know and I can get that to you. But there's so many notes that we can get out of this by what we can scrape up each week. So we'll do our best. And so we'll go back to what we did 2 weeks ago, which was Abraham believing in God anyway, his life of waiting and being the father of a child, and they had to wait with Sarah and their age. So believing God anyway was 2 weeks ago. And his principle, Morley's principle for the book, is God makes men by showing us how we can believe him anyway in the face of what seem like impossible circumstances. And then we went to last week, which was Joseph and the greater good. So in Morley's book, again, they have the second principle. God makes men by orchestrating even the toughest circumstances of our lives for the greater good. And it talked about how Joseph went through what his family did to him and the circumstances of feeling like he was deserted, and his life did have a purpose and God did have a plan, and he recognized that after he was reunited with his family towards the end of his story that we covered last week. So now we're on to Moses, and here you see some pictures from some movies with Moses into it that are well known from a story later in life. But we're going to cover Moses from the beginning just a little bit, scrape some of that, and we're going to come up from the beginning of who he is up until now. Morley says in his book that God gives us callings and missions to accomplish important things. Who among us hasn't felt led by God to do something that we thought was important but ended up with egg on our face? So in Moses' story, we're covering obviously his beginning, and we're going to cover up just through the killing and so on when we get into some stories here a little later. But in Morley's book, it starts with another example of what he states in the beginning is, I often wondered, was my decision command given to me by God, or was it just me and my selfish wants and needs? So the thing that Morley says that Moses struggled with in his life was doing something for God first, or getting ahead of God first, and not waiting for God to guide him. Instead of he had the real confidence and wanted to be ahead of everyone and in what God had planned for him, but that he learned was a character issue. So in relating that, away? Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. So in coming to things with my life, as in Moses, and what Morley talks about is the things that we think God is telling us about, and we do go ahead of him. And I've done that in my life where I think God is leading me to do something, and I often wonder afterwards, am I doing this on my own account, or am I just hearing things, or is it really from God? 3 weeks ago, we did cover like knowing God's voice. So in my life, that has really been a difficult pattern of, am I being led by God, or am I just being led by my own selfish wants to push things away and try to go ahead of God? So in that, are we really hearing God in his word, or are we hearing it from us or someone else?
All right.
All right. So go ahead, Todd.
All right. So we're going to move to the story of Moses and how he struggled with these issues. If you know anything about the history of the pharaohs in Egypt, and it connects really well to Joseph, if you remember in the story of Joseph, the Pharaoh gave him great favor and gave him a lot of notoriety and a position really high up in his country, put him in charge of a lot of people, and made him kind of a VIP or a VP in his organization. But by the time that Moses comes around, that Pharaoh has died, and there's a new Pharaoh that actually has a total different approach and perspective on the Israelites. He's very threatened by them as they've grown in great numbers now, by thousands and maybe even into the millions, and he's kind of scared of their influence and their power as a people, and so he puts them into slavery. To slow their growth, he even made an edict to kill all the Israelite boys, young boys. And so in response to that, our picture there at the top is after Moses' mother put him into a tar pitch basket and floated him down the river, hoping that someone far away from their land would save him and raise him, and his life would be spared, even though she would have to give up raising him. And it just so happened that an Egyptian princess or queen found the baby and took compassion on him and decided to raise him as her own, even calling a nearby servant girl, not realizing it was Moses' sister, and she got to help raise her brother in the house of Pharaoh. And so his life changed dramatically from what it would have been like being raised as a normal Israelite. He's raised in the palace with education, with wealth, money, esteem, the nicest clothes, the nicest food, really in isolation from the Israelites and his own people, that the Hebrews. And so, when you come to the story of the Prince of Egypt, when he gets to be an adolescent, and some of your kids, and maybe you even would admit you've seen the movie, it's pretty good. But then he kind of comes to figure out what's really happening with his people and the relationship between the Israelites and the Egyptians, and how it's really that they're adversaries. And so the Bible, when it says that he was no ordinary child, from the very beginning, Acts is right, that he was destined for greatness. His life started out really weird, took a huge change, and then that's only the beginning of many things that are going to happen in Moses' life that teach us great lessons. But this next video tells us what happens that once he becomes to realize really what's happening to his people, and he's a pretty confident guy that tends to act first and think later. And this is what happens.
More grand, more splendid than any other monument in Upper or Lower Egypt. Look, fate has turned our little misadventure into a great opportunity. I know Father will be so pleased with what you are.
Put your back into it! Faster!
And this was just the beginning. A gateway will open to an entire new city of white limestone, more dazzling than the sun. And here, a statue of Hathor, god of
Hurry!
by two great column halls.
Stop it!
No.
Somebody's got to stop this!
There's nothing that we can do. Stop it! Stop! Stop it! Leave that man alone! Moses! Out of my way, move!
No.
Who did this?
Up there! It's him! Over there!
Moses!
What's going on? Moses!
And so Moses tries to run away, full disclosure, Hollywood did its own version of this story. In the Bible, actually, Moses did in fact kill a slave driver, Egyptian slave driver, but then attempted to cover it up and bury him, but didn't bury him deep enough. And people discovered him, and then they discovered that Moses actually was the one that did this and captured him. And so he was taken prisoner then. And his life takes a huge turn again. He went from being an Israelite nobody to all of a sudden being in the Egyptian palace and getting everything given to him on a silver platter. And then now, because he's done this and he's killed an Egyptian, then we see in this next video that he loses everything.
The slave who would be king. Captain, the robe of state. His Hebrew mother brought it to the prison before she died.
I'd rather this be your armor.
You will have need of a scepter. Give me this binding pole. Here is your king's scepter, and here is your kingdom. With the scorpion, the cobra, and the lizard for subjects. Free them if you will. Leave the Hebrews to me. Give this prince of Israel 1 day's ration of bread and water.
1 day's ration. It'll take many days to cross this wilderness, if he can cross at all.
I commend you to your Hebrew God, who has no name. If you die, it will be by his hand, not by mine. One-time brother.
Into the blistering wilderness of Shur, the man who walked with kings now walks alone. Torn from the pinnacle of royal power, stripped of all rank and earthly wealth, a forsaken man, without a country, without a hope. His soul in turmoil, like the hot winds and raging sands that lash him with the fury of a taskmaster's whip. He is driven forward, always forward, by a God unknown or a land unseen.
Go ahead, Tim.
So really at this point, we don't know. Patrick Morley in his book says that, and this opened my eyes to, and what Morley represents in this book is that Moses was driven into the wilderness, and then when he was leading the Israelites through, he was leading them through the wilderness, which is a neat analogy. But this is where Morley says that in his book as well, that Moses was very confident, and he felt led at that time when he killed that slave, or the Egyptian, that he was meant to be where he's supposed to be, and he had so much cockiness to him that he went ahead of God. He did get prophecy and words from God that he was to be the leader of the Israelites, but he was going ahead of God, and he really wasn't in character ready for that. And until Moses now, what you've seen here, he goes into the desert. It says in Morley's book, maybe when he was in his 40s is when he came out of the wilderness. We don't actually know when he was in there, but he survived, and he had to go through a lot of humility. So Moses was a man of confidence and leadership skills, but his character was needing an overhaul, probably due to the entrenchment of the Egyptian culture, because they were just very confident like it showed in the Pharaoh in this movie. That's how confident they were. So Moses' timing and pride was way off. So he rallied, or he was hailed by God's standards, and he failed by God's standards and God's timing. So he talks about biblical time, like Bible time, that a day to God is 1,000 years to us. We don't know when that timing is, and that's why we should be led by God instead of us going ahead of him. So we may be called by God to do something, but we must learn to wait and listen to him before plotting ahead of God. God should lead, and then we should follow, and we should never be the other way around. Moses' stumbles made him humble. So all the things when he was, he even thought right after the slave incident, going back, it Morley covers in the book too, is that he actually thought he was the one chosen. He was confident about that. And when he approached another Israelites, they said, "Who are you to be our judge and our leader?" So when that happened, he was confused, like, boy, even the own Israelites don't even want me. I'm a failure. And then when he got taken out into the desert, when he got discovered, found, hunted down, and then cast in the desert, how could he not think that he was a failure? So he stumbled through all this this process. So it's always a process in God's time, biblical time. So instead of wanting us to get back to normal, to get out of this unfortunate circumstances, be glad we're in the situation, Morley says, because we can learn so much, and it is shaping who we are and remodeling us. So in that process, we should be glad, not wanting to get out of that situation, as with all the characters from Abraham so far, and Joseph, and Moses is no exception, probably the others that we're going to be going through. It's that timing, and it's the process and following what God is wanting us to do. Now we're at the point in the book where Moses is humbled when we get to the burning bush, and now he thinks he isn't qualified to lead, but God tells him he is ready. So this is where we pick up another big
Here I am. Take the sandals from your feet. For the place on which you stand is holy ground. Who are you? I am that I am. I don't understand. I am the God of your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
You were born of my mother, you heaven. You are our brother.
What do you want with me? I have seen the oppression of my people in Egypt, and have heard their cry.
Stop it! Leave that man alone!
So I have come down to deliver them out of slavery and bring them to a good land. A land flowing with milk and honey. And so unto Pharaoh I shall send you, me. Who am I to lead these people? They'll never believe me, they won't even listen. I shall teach you what to say.
Let my people go!
But I was their enemy. I was the prince of Egypt, the son of the man who slaughtered their children. You've chosen the wrong messenger. How can I even speak to these people?
Who made man's power? Who made the deaf, the mute, the seeing, or the blind? Did not I?
smite Egypt with all my wonders. Take the staff in your hand, Moses. With it, you shall do my wonders. I shall be with you, Moses.
So did you catch it? At the beginning, when he thought he was ready, when he was all that confident and a young man, he thought that he could handle it. He could do it right away. He had that confidence before he went ahead of God. And now, at this point, he feels he's not worthy. That who am I to lead? You know, they don't even want him. And all this other rhetoric that he was hearing in his own mind that disqualified him. Yet God was saying, now you are qualified because of his humbled heart. Morley has another great example here of the process, and we can learn from this 5-step process. He says, I've found the process of transformation, and learning humility often goes like this. And step 1, I tell God what I'm going to do. Number 2, God responds. Number 3, I beg God to let me do it anyway. Step 4, he humbles me until I listen. Step 5, God tells me what he is going to do. This is a great example of Moses and so many other millions of men that go through that 5-step process that are doing it the wrong way, but yet God is patient and he leads us one step at a time as a transformation for us. So this is where the Bible tells us Moses is now more humble than anyone else on earth. That's Numbers 12:3 says. Now Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the earth, on the face of the earth. And now God is the one that was going ahead, and he was following God. He wasn't leading God. So God is never more near than he seems far away. And that's one of Morley's quotes. So in Moses, this is principle number 3 that Morley states. God makes men by taking us through a humbling process that fundamentally changes the way we think. And this is almost applies, I would think, across the board, that we always want to go ahead of God. We can't help us. And again, we're processed by spiritual battles, so we're tempted to do this and go ahead of God, and we want to be like God. But in this principle, his 3rd principle here for this chapter is God makes men by taking us through a humbling process that fundamentally changes the way we think. So our question for your week, and kind of into our small group, what does God have to do to keep you humble? Do you have to get down so low that you've learned a lesson and you know that to put him first? Is it an experience through God by talking to him? So what does God have to do to keep you humble?